Well, good morning, everybody. It is that time of the month, and we are live on our LinkedIn page. So, hello, I'm Marianne, and this is my colleague Alex. This month, we are going to be talking about our Ignite Change Audit. It's one of our products that we use a lot with clients, and we thought it'd be a good opportunity to do a bit of a deep dive. But before we jump into that, I was just going to ask Alex how she's getting on with her streaming eyes, because those of you who tuned in last month will realise that Alex was suffering quite badly with her hay fever. So Alex, how's it going?
It's good. It's good. I'm obviously allergic to something earlier in the season, and it's all good. But it was awful last time. I thought about cancelling because it was just, I was like a snivelling, dribbling wreck. So my apologies for that.
Well, but see, you know, lots of people do suffer with hay fever, don't they? And touch wood, thankfully I don't. So
it's horrid.
It's not something I need to worry about. So today's topic, the audit. So I'm going to do it sort of like an informal, off-the-cuff chat today. So Alex, do you want to explain first off what the audit is and how it works, and then we can sort of start sharing a few sort of snippets from different clients that we've used it with and the successes that they've seen from it.
Yeah, great. So the Ignite Change Audit is essentially a culture audit of your organisation. So when clients come to us, they tend to say, we kind of know what we want to achieve and where we want to be and what we want to look and feel like culturally, and the impact that we want that to have on the organisational results and on the people who work within the organisation, but they don't necessarily know where to start. So the audit was born out of us going into organisations to understand where it is now, how it feels to work in the organisation, what things get in the way. One example we quite often use is, you know, the organisation says it's really customer friendly, but actually when we go out to do the audit and we say, you know, one of the values is customer friendly, talk to us about how easy it is to give customers the solutions they need. And people say it's actually really tough. And these are the reasons why. So they're things that, you know, at an executive level, you might not necessarily know because they happen at a different level to you in the organisation. And if you don't have the mechanisms to hear that employee voice with that feedback, those obstacles, they're things that actually sometimes are really easily fixed. And I know that we talked before about the fact that at Flint, we see culture as very holistic. So we don't just see it about values and behaviours. It's fine to say a value is customer first, and these are the behaviours that sit with underneath that. You need to be solution focused. You need to have ownership of customer problems. But actually, if your processes and your ways of working and your silo mentality within the organisation don't enable that, then in fact, you won't be customer first. So for us, culture is much bigger actually than just the values and behavioural piece. So the audit, and in a moment, we'll show you the wheel that we work off of. So the audit is an opportunity for us to go into the organisation. We do a set of interviews. We interview at exec level, board level, but we also interview, depending on the size of the organisation, a cross-functional group of people that sit in all different parts at all different levels of the organisation. And we ask them the same, if not very similar questions around what the culture feels, looks, tastes, smells like right now. And then we talk to them about the shift that's required and some of the things that we could do in order to create that shift. And we have a 4 E's approach, which we love. And the first E is explore. But actually later on is one of the E's is engage. And this is our first chance to start to engage people, because even though it's really exploratory, it is people recognizing that we are asking their opinion, we care about what they say. And eventually, once we go back, play back, and then we start to make changes, they become engaged, you know, sort of through that exploratory process. So it's a really, really powerful tool, isn't it, that we love running.
Yeah, it's a great tool. I was going to sort of jump in maybe with a few sort of things, because sometimes when I'm talking to people about the audit, they'll say, well, how many people do you interview, and how do you know who to interview? And I think it's my answer is usually it's determined by two things: A, the size of your organisation, and B, often by your budget. So as long as there's a good cross section of people across your functions, then we get a good sense of what's going on.
Yeah.
But you do also have to consider geographic locations and time zones. So do you want to talk a little bit more about time zones and how we manage that?
Yeah, so really good question. So first of all, I think, if we were to take the small to medium sized businesses that we've worked with, where they've got, let's say, up to 100 people, we've generally talked to up to a third of that organisation. And some of those are in large focus groups that we facilitate. So it's not time in terms of, one-to-one interviews. Some of them are bigger focus groups that we can spend time with a larger number of people. And we've also run surveys so that we get to a wider number of people, a larger number of people at less cost. There's definitely some downsides to that. We quite often find ourselves one of the things we hear a lot is, well, you never put your head above the parapet in this business. There's always a consequence if you give feedback. And we quite often say, okay, well, what have recent consequences been? And people will say, we say, have people been fired as a result of that? And people quite often say, well, no. And actually it allows us to probe into that. Well, is that corporate memory? Is that something that happened many, many years ago? And quite often it is actually, and it's something that stays with people. So we're not able to do that so much on a survey, but the survey still brings really rich data. So we're able to do that in many different ways. Your question was about time zones. So in the middle of our culture wheel, if you are a global organisation,
do you want me to pop the culture wheel
out?
Up?
That would be great. We do. So if you're a global organisation, in the middle where it says Flint organisational culture model, we add another element in that, which is the global cultural overlay. So wherever we are in the world, we sometimes have a different lens that we see culture through, because we have our own global country cultures or regional cultures that become really important. So, so we would run remote sessions for global teams. Sometimes we get flown out, but not that often. And I think in our hybrid world now, I think remote sessions are really acceptable. And we have to consider any global kind of cultural overlays in addition to our culture wheel elements. So a couple of examples are when we spoke to a team in China, and they talked to us about the fact that they actually are much less comfortable challenging in a one-to-one group without being given, in a larger group, without being given permission to do so. So we have to adapt our style appropriately to that group as well, to make sure that we get rich data and people feel comfortable and psychologically safe in that environment. And on some occasions, we've had deep data back, and the client has said, actually, we'd like you to just do more regional work, because, we've come back and said, actually, it's quite HQ heavy, and where we've had less contact with regionals, actually, it's giving us something really, really relevant. And many times, Maz, as you will know, we do get told that, London feels like the HQ. And so a big part of the cultural recommendations are bringing a much more inclusive, view
approach
of the regions. Yeah. So just while you've got this on, Maz, so the culture audit tends to work around our different elements, doesn't it? So we do look at clarity and purpose, the extent to which everybody understands the vision, the strategy, and the part that they play. So, we would ask what part you play in finance in order to achieve that strategy, and the extent to which people understand that golden thread and the element that they do is, becomes fundamental. Symbols, rituals, and stories. So, we talk about the kind of cultural rituals that the organisation has. Are they positive? Do they provide outcomes? Are they helpful? Do they aid belonging and inclusivity? Communication, is it two-way communication? Is there room for the employee voice? Do people feel heard? Measures and goals. We think we're quite unique in using this, but it's really thrown up some fascinating results for us in culture audits, where when people in one section of the organisation are measured completely differently to somebody in another. And so subsequently their agendas and their focus and their bonuses potentially are driven by something completely different. And that impacts culture, it impacts behaviour, impacts the way people work together. Values, really obvious one. Do people even know what they are? And do they know certainly what behaviours that means? How do successful people get on in this organisation? And what are the kind of unwritten rules behaviourally that people get away with? So there's a huge amount in there. And then ways of working looks at those kind of obstacles that people find to be, for example, customer friendly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm as you watch more of our sort of chit chats that we have, some people call it a fireside conversation. I always think, sitting in a pub with a fire and a glass of wine, but we're quite informal, and I'm kind of like more of the sort of the project manager person. So let's talk a little bit about how the audit itself is actually structured, because Alex has just given us a really great insight as to how we use the cultural model. But from a sort of nitty gritty, what does it feel like? What does it look like when we come and do an audit? Is basically, it's probably more sexy wording, but we have a series of questions against each of these elements of the cultural wheel, and we work our way through them in a series of interviews, group conversations, whether they are face-to-face or the power of Zoom and Teams. We did a lot of that, didn't we, during COVID times where we couldn't travel, but also, rather than jumping on a plane as well, we're working with some clients in Asia. So yes, there's a set of questions against each element that drill into each of those sort of descriptors that Alex has taken us through, and that's how it works and how it feels when somebody's going through that process. So Alex, I don't know if you wanted to give a little bit of your sort of HR and psychological insights into that, because I kind of tend to manage the logistics of that side of it.
And I think you've explained it really well, to be honest. I think the only builds is that when we feed back, which we'll get to in a moment, everything is thematic. So there's no individual, nothing is attributed to an individual. So what we're looking for are themes across the organisation that people feel strongly about. That's not to say we won't put in things that might be outlying, but we'll be focusing potentially on those things where there's a really strong feeling around the fact that it can have a big impact. And that's how the recommendations kind of tend to be formed. So there's some sort of thematic analysis really around, in an informal way, probably. I need to be careful there, but around the way that we group that. So it's a completely confidential conversation. Nothing is attributed to an individual. And in particular, in those groups, people tend to feed off each other really well. Somebody will say something and somebody else say, oh, that's not the case in our team. It doesn't work like that. And that enables us to probe a bit further. So, one of the things that we find is that there are tribes within each culture. So finance might have a particular type of culture. Then there's a particular type of culture in IT, tech. And, that becomes really relevant as well. So, we get a lot of people who challenge each other within those conversations. So it's a very safe environment. And I think people can. I was
just going to jump in. Sorry. So one of the things I know you touched on, but I think it's really important to stress here, is that when we are working with our clients to agree how many groups we need to talk to, we always try and make sure that there was a cross section of people from the different business areas, business units, teams, because like Alex was saying, if you have just everybody from one team, you can get quite a narrow perspective. And it's a really interesting conversation to observe and drill into when you've got people from different teams and they have got different perspectives, and that can often be down to the leader or the length of service of people in that team, or just those particular individuals and how they manage themselves. So I don't know, Alex, if you wanted to sort of share a little bit more about that.
Well, I think you've explained it really well. I mean, I think in particular, if you're a financial services organisation and the regulator is interested in the type of culture you have, for example, in relation to risk, we can drill in much better as an external organisation than perhaps you can internally. And it's having people across the board who are able to say that's not the case within our part of the organisation. And we can come offline and drill further into each of those, but it does create that sort of internal challenge, which is great. And I think, increasingly regulators are looking to understand, if this happened, what processes do you have in place? And by having a culture audit, you are in a really strong place to be able to say, culturally, how do people feel about whistleblowing, about talking about risk, about identifying risks within the organisation? And that's the kind of thing that we can add in under the way we work, under behaviours. We can also explore the extent to which people are able to articulate the risk strategy, for example. So it's a really, really helpful. I mean, it's useful for all organisations, but we have done a lot of work in financial services, and it's a really helpful tool. And then I think just to really pick up on what then happens is that we write a report, and the reports are usually quite detailed, and they are written under each section. So there's an executive summary, clear key findings, clear detail under each elements of the culture wheel, with a global overlay and a leadership. So in that internal ring, it says leadership, and that we see that as being absolutely fundamental. Our leaders living that culture. And then the report. So there's detailed findings under each of those elements, and then there are a set of recommendations. So to give you an example of a financial services client recently, they had 18 recommendations, and they started with, we need to change the performance system. At the moment, there's no objective performance system. So there's bonuses being paid out, but actually there was some behaviours that others were questioning. So that was one of the key things. With another organisation, actually, Marianne, that the performance thing was very similar. And in fact, we heard last week that in their employee engagement survey, their result for "I'm now having meaningful conversations about performance" had gone up significantly. So, the recommendations are quite practical, and they are things that clients could do themselves, and things that we can help clients with. Other recommendations have included people don't recognise the values, or they don't understand them, so we need to do more work on embedding those values. We need other recommendations have included having a better induction. So we quite often work with growth financial services or professional services organisations who are in really accelerated growth period. So they are recruiting a lot of people very quickly, and the induction isn't strong enough, for example. So very practical, and there's a number of recommendations within that, including global town halls, so that the messaging is seen across the global sites. They include things like improving two-way dialogue so the employee voice is heard. They include things like having a people dashboard at exec level. All a huge range of recommendations, and we play that back to the exec in quite a direct way. And I think I'm going to post on LinkedIn, actually, just to say, actually, it takes quite a lot of courage to do a culture audit. But we generally get fabulous feedback in terms of how useful they are.
Great. Well, I mean, you sort of touched on some of it there, because what I was then going to sort of move us on to was to talking about some of the recommendations that we have shared with clients, and some of the sort of work that we've supported on the back of those, and then some of the results. But you've given a couple of examples. I don't know if you want to go into a little bit more detail. So on one of the audits that we did in the services sector was around the values, and I can remember in those group sessions a lot of the colleagues said, yes, I know where the values poster is. Well, great. Can you tell us what the values are? And I don't think there was anybody who could tell us what all of the values were. So, you know, quite obviously one of the recommendations was that your people don't know what your values are. So therefore they're not living and breathing them.
Yeah. And actually, when we dug in further to say, this is, you know, the strategy, and people said, yes, we do. It's very ambitious. It's very exciting. We said, when you then take those values, do they feel like they're the right ones to drive this real accelerated push for change and for results? And actually, they said no. So there was, you know, even when we told them what the values were, we said, you know, do they feel like the right kind of things that you need to be doing from a behavioural perspective to drive this change, to drive these results? And people said no. Really, what we need to be doing is being a little bit more agile in the way that we make decisions. We need to be, you know, and so that again starts that engagement process, because even though it's in our explore piece, so we have explore, engage, empower, and experience. So at some point we start to empower the organisation to be able to take this on, be sustainable, and then the experience piece is, you know, living that. And actually, you know, in one client recently, in terms of their experience, their ENPS went up. I will need to look at it, so forgive me, but more than 10 points.
Alex is being jargony there. So employee
net promoter score. So it's an employee engagement metric. And so, you know, that experience, you know, we've got some great measures. And in fact, we know that we're not good enough at telling people about the outcomes that we create. And we had our away day, and we are going to get better at that. So, you know, 2 really strong outcomes. So, yeah, it's a product that we love, we feel very proud of, and we have excellent feedback about, and we'd like to do more.
Yeah. Well, I don't have anything else to talk about that today. So I think we have, we've given you a sort of a description of what it is, how it works. We've given you some examples of the results and findings and recommendations that we've had, and kind of explained that it's a set of questions. It's very informal and it's completely confidential. So anything you sort of summarize there, Alex?
I think it's about creating an insight for you as execs around what it's like to live and work in your organization. And it creates simple and practical recommendations that allow you to shift your culture, rather than feeling that culture is just this huge conceptual, intangible thing. That would be my summary.
Wonderful. Right. Well, thank you everybody who's watching live, and for the rest of you who are watching on catch up, we will see you next month. If you have any questions in the meantime about our culture audit, then do drop one of us a message or comment on the post once this works behind the scenes and gets posted on our LinkedIn page. Thank you very much.
See you all.
See you later.
Bye.